Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. I just heaved a big sigh as we start to record this intro to a very important episode. It's Friday after a week of just mind-bending tragedy in this country, the events of Wednesday, the storming of the Capitol, a coup, an insurrection, president inciting thousands of people to mobs to storm the Capitol. People are dead. People were frightened. Our democracy has been deeply wounded. And I hear increasingly words like treason and sedition and incitement. And so I want to know what those words really mean as applied here. And I think we all need to understand it. And I think they do apply, as you'll hear from our guest. Carlton Larson is a professor of law at UC Davis, University of California at Davis Law School, north of San Francisco. And he's written 2 books on treason. And I think the history of treason in our country, cases where it's been applied, and how Professor Larson sees it applied here is really something we need to understand. We need to call this what it is. We need to make sure that this does not become normalized. And most importantly, there needs to be accountability. So stay tuned for an extremely important, informative episode of this podcast. And everyone, please stay safe and well as the virus continues to surge. Take all the precautions you have been taking for yourself and your family, and enjoy this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. I want to welcome my guest today, Professor Carlton Larson, who is the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at UC Davis School of Law in California, and the author of the book On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law, as well as the book, The Trials of Allegiance, Treason, Juries, and the American Revolution. Professor Larson, who knew that this conversation would be as acutely relevant as it is, given the horrendous events of yesterday, the storming of the United States Capitol. So first of all, we're going to get into that, but first of all, thank you and welcome to Good Law, Bad Law.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
When I arranged to speak with you, my initial thought was how much in recent weeks and indeed in recent months we've seen the words treason and sedition mentioned most often by those deeply upset about President Trump's conduct and so much of the enabling conduct of members of Congress and others when it comes to the lead up to the November election and all of what we've seen unfold since November 3rd to overturn the results of that election, sometimes by President Trump himself, who seems to use the word treason to describe the conduct of anybody who he disagrees with. Everyone he agrees with is a patriot. Everyone he doesn't like somehow is engaging in treasonous conduct. So I really wanted to get at what these terms actually are in the law so we can use them correctly. And then the events happened yesterday and put an even finer point on the question. So I guess first, let me get your reaction to what happened yesterday. Many are calling it an insurrection, an attempted coup. That certainly sounds like treasonous conduct. And we've heard that on the news quite a bit over the last 24 hours. What do you make of what happened yesterday in Washington, D.C. at the Capitol?
Well, it really was an absolutely horrific moment, really one of the worst days in the history of the United States. And clearly multiple crimes were committed, and sort of just you can start at the low level. There's obviously trespass and firearms offenses and theft and destruction of property and all the sorts of things one ordinarily associates with this type of disorder. But there's also, of course, the fact that this wasn't just, going into a Walmart, right? This was the United States Capitol to disrupt the votes for President and Vice President of the United States. So it really does raise, I think, much more serious issues of criminal law. So insurrection doesn't really have a very clear legal meaning. There is in the U.S. Code a provision that says whoever incites, sets on foot, assists, or engages in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States, can be imprisoned for up to 10 years. There's really very little case law on that as to what counts as insurrection. Although interestingly, the term insurrection also appears in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and it bars any person who is engaged in insurrection from holding public office if they have previously taken an oath to uphold the United States. So that we may see that issue come up, particularly with respect to the fact, I think at least one or two of the folks who entered the Capitol were actually office holders in some places. So there's that. There's then, people use the term sedition very broadly. There's no distinct crime called sedition. I mean, it's all up to how statutes define it. We've had various sedition acts throughout our history. Most notably the one in 1798, the ones in 1918, which were aimed at restricting speech. For the most part, those are unconstitutional under modern First Amendment doctrine. So we do have the seditious conspiracy statute, which does seem to be a pretty good fit for what happened yesterday. And this says, if two or more persons conspire to, among other things, by force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States, well, that was delaying the Electoral Count Act, by force, or by force to seize, take, or possess any property of the United States, well, they clearly, for a brief moment, possessed the United States Capitol, and that includes a potential sentence of up to 20 years. So that's possible. And then at the most extreme, we have the issue of treason. Which I wrote about in a piece for the Washington Post today. And the issue here is whether or not the protesters levied war against the United States. And I think under the early 19th century, late 18th century case law, they probably did. Because what those cases essentially said was if you use force to try to prevent the operation of any law of the United States, that is levying war against the United States. And that would seem to be what happened here. Now it's complicated because there's later 19th century case law that suggests you have to have an intent to overthrow the government entirely and not just obstruct the operation of one law. And it's not clear whether all the people at that in the Capitol had that actual intent. It may well vary depending on the individuals who are involved. And then the further problem is there really has been no meaningful case law on the issue of levying war against the United States since the mid 19th century. So we're dealing with very, very old body of law in trying to figure out how it might apply in this circumstance. I think there's a theoretical argument for why you could bring a treason charge against these protesters. In the real world, I don't think there's any likelihood that prosecutors will run with that because they've got so many other tools at their disposal.
Well, so far you've mentioned treason and some different varieties of sedition or seditious conduct. And there are a lot of hands in what happened yesterday. There's those who stormed the Capitol themselves and occupied it for a period of time, and then there are those around it, all the way up to President Trump himself. So let me try and break some of this down a little bit. I think it's fascinating that treason has such a history, going back to the framers, going back to George Washington, because at least in rhetorical terms, Republicans and conservatives, many of the same who spoke out in great numbers during the electoral count process yesterday and late last night, claimed to be originalists, invoke the framers, the founders for the source of what we should understand the Constitution and the law to mean today. And you tell a couple of the stories of the early application of treason. It's unfortunate that all of the examples you give seem to involve bad conduct in Pennsylvania.
Well, my first book is actually entirely set in Pennsylvania. So yeah, it's a great state.
Yeah, it gives you a lot to work with. But let's talk about George Washington first. I mean, obviously, our first president, father of the country, some would say, as well as a founder. But also, as you point out, it was George Washington who laid the foundation stone for the United States Capitol, where all this took place yesterday. So in George Washington's time, how was treason understood and how was it applied?
Well, so George Washington, of course, had presided over the Constitutional Convention, which had drafted the treason clause of the Constitution. Washington was, of course, a traitor to Great Britain, as were all of the leading members of the revolutionary generation. And so they were worried that treason charges could be abused. And so we have this very restrictive definition in Article 3 that says treason is limited to levying war against the United States or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. And then it was really during George Washington's administration that this was tested for the first time in federal court. What would treason mean now that Washington was not a rebel, but the president and the head of government? And so what you had in Western Pennsylvania was you had thousands of men in arms to resist the federal excise tax on whiskey. And they believed that this was an unconstitutional improper tax, and Washington's response was, in some ways, you might almost say quite draconian. Right? He assembled an army, personally led the army at least some of the way. Alexander Hamilton was the other person who was largely responsible for this, and they went to Pennsylvania and they crushed this with military force. Said, no, you don't get to do this. Your elected representatives pass this law, and if you don't like it, vote them out. That's the way democracy works. You don't just get to start waving guns around because you think something went wrong. And they took a hand, about 20 or 25 of these people went back to Philadelphia for trial, and they were charged with treason. And there were arguments made that they hadn't committed treason, but the justices, and this was the time when Supreme Court justices sat on trial court cases quite frequently. So in all these cases, there was a Supreme Court justice sitting, and they all said that, yes, this was treason. Now, the cases ended up kind of fizzling out because of various problems with evidence, and ultimately 2 people were convicted, and one of them was found to be somewhat mentally impaired, and the other really just had not played a major role at all. So at the end of the day, President Washington ended up pardoning them, and so no person was executed or imprisoned for the role in the Whiskey Rebellion. But that was essentially the response of the people who had drafted our Constitution when they saw this type of internal disorder. And then about 5 years later, when in Eastern Pennsylvania, when Freeze's Rebellion broke out, the John Adams administration also prosecuted those protesters. They had essentially rescued a person from prison, tried to thwart a federal marshal. And then too, there were treason prosecutions brought. Ultimately there too, Adams ended up pardoning the people involved based on the facts of the case. That he thought at the end of the day, it actually wasn't treason, it was just a riot. But those decisions have never really, they haven't been formally overruled. We have later 19th century case law that modifies it quite a bit. But in theory, they're still out there.
Well, and I want to get to the case that you mentioned, because I think that actually provides some flesh on the bone of those bones from the very earliest years of our country, in a way that, as I read your article in the Post today, I think seems quite relevant today. But I just want to go back to one point on Article 3 of the Constitution and what it says is treason, because you've given us two possible bases. One is adhering to enemies of the United States and giving them aid and comfort. And then the other is levying war. And those have not only been applied differently, as you explain it, but get at one of the questions I imagine a lot of people have about treason, which is they probably imagine treason involves some act in aiding a foreign, as opposed to some act from within the United States against a fellow citizen. And it's so explain that difference, because it's the levying war part in Article 3.
There's essentially these two strands of treason, and so levying war against the United States is essentially the internal form of treason. That is, you're trying to overthrow the government by force from within. And then treason by aiding the enemy is always external. So it has to be aid to some foreign nation or group with whom the United States is in a state of open war. And all of the 20th century cases of treason and the 121st century case have all been cases of aiding the enemy. And so we haven't had a levying war case for a very long time. The most recent one would have been in the state of West Virginia in the 1920s, where under state treason law, miners who had resisted state law in West Virginia were charged with treason against the state of West Virginia by levying war against it. And so that's now nearly 100 years ago. And so I think as a result, when people, you're right, when people think of treason, they almost always are thinking of it in terms of betrayal to some foreign adversary. But that actually was far less common in most of the history of treason law, both in England and in the early United States. It tended to be much more focused on this levying war provision. That's where, for example, the Aaron Burr case was a case of levying war, and of course, Whiskey Rebellion, Freeze's Rebellion, and then later 19th century cases as well.
Well, and that seems to bring back the concept of insurrection, a term that has been used by a number of people to describe what happened at the Capitol this week, including Mitch McConnell, the now outgoing Senate Majority Leader, now the Senate Minority Leader. Mitch McConnell referred to the mob storming the Capitol as representing an insurrection. If you wage an insurrection, isn't that levying war, as we'd have to understand Article 3 of the Constitution?
Well, it would depend on what the insurrection was. I mean, so there's a very precise body of case law dealing with what is levying war and what is not. And I think insurrection is sometimes used in a broader, more colloquial sense to cover things that might not technically be levying war, but could be viewed as insurrection. I think that's actually why the insurrection statute was passed during the Civil War, partly is to get at some things where you might have problems with treason. One issue is with treason, you need two witnesses to the same overt act. That's required under Article 3. For other crimes of disloyalty, you don't have that same two-witness requirement. And it's just really unclear what insurrection as such means. I mean, we do have it in U.S. code. It refers to rebellion or insurrection, which is sort of an interesting phrase. Well, what's the difference between a rebellion? How is that different than an insurrection? How do you, because it seems to suggest that those are two different things. And this is an area of law where you have to be very, very careful, because this is precisely where sort of the worst excesses of authoritarian government can creep in. Because you could imagine, what, Donald Trump let loose with a very broad definition of insurrection would do. So I think one has to be quite careful in using a term like this.
Well, and then you talk in your article, and I want to mention it here as well, the case that that came about in the 1850s, which I think gives some additional detail and understanding to the concept of levying war and treason, that it can't just be opposition, even angry mob-like opposition to one particular law. It really has to be directed more at the overthrow of the government in some way, and that was during President Fillmore's administration, and involved the Fugitive Slave Act. So how does that case add detail to this?
Yes, this is a very important case. It's also a case from Pennsylvania, of course. And so this is a case, it involves the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which was meant to enforce the provisions of Article 4 of the Constitution that said that if an enslaved person escaped into a free state, they don't become free. They have to be returned to enslavement. And this was a law that became a lot stricter than the prior version of the Fugitive Slave Act. And one concern was that essentially it allowed white Southerners to just come into the North and seize free blacks, claim that they were a slave, and then drag them back to the South. The law was structured so that you're supposed to go to a hearing before a federal commissioner, and if the commissioner found that the person was enslaved, the commissioner would get a $10 fee.
Mm.
If they found the person was not enslaved, they would get a $5 fee. So the whole thing was, completely weighted in favor
Yeah.
of slavery. So in this particular case, you had an enslaver in Maryland named Edward Gorsuch, who was actually a distant relative of our Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, and he went into Pennsylvania to try to find 3 men who had escaped from slavery. And they ended up at a house in Christiana, Pennsylvania, where Gorsuch ended up being shot. The people in the house had been part of a self-protection society. They sounded the horn of warning. Various people came to protect them, and they say, we're free people. We're just here are these folks coming to seize us. So this became known as the Christiana Riot. It became a really kind of just cause celeb in the South that here a slave owner had been murdered. And the Fillmore administration decided to prosecute the men involved for treason against the United States, for levying war against the United States. And they indicted a number of men, almost all of whom were African Americans, the only African Americans ever charged with treason against the United States, and then one white man, Kastner Hanway, who they believed was the leader of the group. And this trial took place in the 2nd floor of Independence Hall, when that was serving as a federal courthouse. And then the issue was, well, is this legally treason? So we could assume, for purposes of argument, that they used force to try to prevent the execution of the Fugitive Slave Act. Well, under the Whiskey Rebellion and Freeze's Rebellion cases, that could be seen as levying war against the United States. But in a very important opinion, Justice Robert Greer, who was certainly actually quite pro-Southern. He joins the majority in the Dred Scott case, but he says, no, this is not treason. The general trend of later cases, both in the US and in the United Kingdom, was that levying war requires a design to overthrow the government entirely, and not just to resist the application of one particular law. And so he said, as a matter of law, there simply was nothing that counts as treason in what happened in Christiana. Now that's a trial court decision, but it's also by a Supreme Court justice, and it's sort of the most recent significant statement on the meaning of levying war. So that's why I say in the article, I do think that modern courts would follow this if the issue ever came up.
Well, and that makes sense. And as a general matter, I think you have to be absolutely right. You don't want treason to be broadly defined in the hands of, say, President Trump or anyone applying treason too broadly. It could be used to serve very authoritarian and undemocratic purposes. But unlike the Fugitive Slave Act, a horrible law, a stain on our country that we had such a law, what was being opposed violently when the Capitol was stormed this week wasn't just a law, it was really an elemental part of the Constitution, the counting of the state electors to certify the election of a president. And it wasn't just an act against that law either. It was an act against the institution. And if it is seen that way, again, this isn't someone shooting somebody who enters their own home. This is, thousands of people who overran the Capitol Police and stormed the United States Capitol itself. every single one of the members of Congress's life was at risk, was in danger. And the process of fulfilling their constitutional duty was at risk, with the stated goal of those who incited them, from President Trump to Donald Trump Jr. and on down the line, which was to stop the steal, or what they call the steal. That does seem much closer to an insurrection to overthrow the government than, I say merely, but only relatively speaking, merely an armed uprising against a particular law.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's why this is a hard case, right? I mean, it's the sort of thing I could imagine sticking on a final exam, right? I mean, I don't, you know, the argument you make is certainly a entirely plausible, non-trivial argument for why what we saw yesterday actually was treason by levying war against the United States. So I don't think that the case law, you know, unequivocally rules that out. I mean, one of the problems then is if the case law talks about overthrow of the government, well, what do you do with a incoming, disrupting the incoming administration, because they're not technically the government now, right? And so, you know, did they, and what did they do once, you know, they got into the Capitol? You know, it appears a lot of them just kind of wandered around. They rifled through desks. They took selfies. But it's not clear they had any obvious plan to do anything, in the sense that they weren't planning to take power themselves. So it's a very odd case in terms of how it fits within treason law. And I think, you know, it may depend on each individual involved. Some of them would probably present stronger cases. I mean, the ones who had, you know, a social media record saying that they're going to Washington to you know, as part of the revolution, because they're there to, you know, to do that seems to me a stronger case than somebody who maybe just wandered in and said, okay, here's my chance to take a free tour of the Capitol.
Yeah, no, it's exactly the next question I was going to ask, because I have seen some of those social media posts that people were either going to or coming from what happened. And one in particular, I saw a woman is asked, why did you go there? What were you trying to do? And she says, it's revolution. It's a revolution. But even, you know, even that, I worry about taking words that could sound very scary to a lot of people, socialist, revolution, you know, rebellion, you know, there's words can be expanded, I think, to depending on who the speaker is. I mean, you know, some of the language of someone like Bernie Sanders could sound very threatening to some people, but you don't want the way he talks and the things he talks about to be seen as treason. You know, but I want to get to a place, whether the crime actually is prosecuted or not, because that raises all kinds of other issues, politics, primary among them, I think. But let me focus on President Trump, because again, I'm watching the news today, and you know, everybody's very upset, understandably. And I'm hearing the words treason, I'm hearing the word sedition, I'm hearing the word coup. President Trump, even as described by Republican senators yesterday, and not only Mitt Romney, but again, Mitch McConnell yesterday from the Senate floor said that President Trump had incited this, that President Trump had directed this. And others have too, and clearly he did. He got in front of this group before they marched to the Capitol and said, let's go march to the Capitol and essentially stop this. Rudy Giuliani said, let's have a day of trial by combat. Donald Trump Jr., said words to the same effect. leaving aside the people themselves who actually stormed the Capitol, President Trump has made no secret about what he wants to see happen. He wants to overturn the election and keep himself installed as president. And that's basically what he was directing these thousands of people yesterday to help him try to accomplish. So does that sound like treason?
So the cases involving levying of war, again, these are all fairly old cases from the early 19th century. They tend to say that basically any person who is involved in the levying of war, and again, assuming that force has actually been used, whatever role they play, no matter how small, is guilty of the crime. And sometimes you hear the phrase, in treason, all are principles. And so if there was in fact a sort of a conspiracy or a plan to do this, and Trump played some role, he potentially could be liable. Now that usually requires some type of prior agreement, and so there would be some issues there in terms of figuring out what he did. The other, potentially cleaner route is to say this is simply incitement to a riot, and then you don't have sort of complicated issues of treason law. You just have a basic question of incitement, and then you have overlaid with that the First Amendment rules of Brandenburg versus Ohio. So I'll be teaching that next week. So this is in many ways sort of a great hypothetical. It's just, well, what counts as incitement? And of course, under Brandenburg, it has to be directed to producing imminent violence or imminent unlawful act, and is likely to produce this. And so it's the standard example of that is stirring up a crowd to a riot. And so then the question is, well, did Trump do that? And so then you get into a lot of very complicated factual questions as to what he meant. And it'd be a much easier case if he'd said storm the Capitol. Right? I think if he said storm the Capitol, then this would be clear. That'd be a clear case of incitement, and he wouldn't have a First Amendment defense. What he would try to say was that, I didn't say that. All I meant was for them to go to the Capitol, march around, make their views heard, etc. And then you'd have, of course, the question of, well, in context, and you could raise the other points that you mentioned, including statements perhaps by other speakers, and some of the history leading up to this. So it would be an interesting case, I think, as to whether or not it was an incitement. Certainly, I think it's not frivolous to think that it might be incitement.
Well, now one of the next day questions is, why did it seem like it was so easy for these thousands of people to breach all of the security around the Capitol, even if you allow that the Capitol Police were outnumbered, were not prepared, whatever you want to say. It is one of the few details about this that's come out so far is that there were requests from inside the Capitol, from the Vice President, from Nancy Pelosi and others, to have the National Guard come in. This is in the District of Columbia, but this is the United States Capitol. It's under federal law, federal law enforcement is responsible for its security. And there have been some reports, let's assume for conversation today that they're true, that President Trump was approached to have the National Guard brought in to support the Capitol Police who were, being overrun by these people, and that he didn't want to call in the National Guard, and there was a delay, significant delay in doing so, and that ultimately it was the Vice President Pence who arranged for the National Guard finally to be brought in. If President Trump knows that these thousands of people who he's just whipped up are marching to the Capitol, and he's back in the White House watching this on television, and he's ultimately the commander in chief and is responsible in some way for holding up the providing of security and blocking this from happening. Where would that behavior, where would that conduct fit into what we're talking about? Treason versus inciting versus seditious conspiracy?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and it's a very hard question, because in this case you would have a person who arguably had some duty to protect, and then who simply failed to perform that duty. There is some case law, at least in the aiding the enemy context, that suggests failure to perform a duty can be treason. So one of the examples from English law was if you had a person who was supposed to be defending one of the king's castles, and the person failed to do so, and they did so because they intended to aid the enemy, well, that would be treason. Now, if they simply failed to defend because of cowardice or incompetence, well, then that wouldn't be treason. So it would turn on your intent in doing nothing. Did your failure to do something constitute treason? And then there's also the interesting question of whether that failure is an overt act subject to 2 eyewitness proof, and then how do you prove exactly when and where the doing nothing happened? So that can be a tricky problem as well. Here you wouldn't be in aiding the enemy case. You would say, well, there was levying war going on, and the president simply failed to do anything about it. That's, I think, probably a harder claim to say that that's actually criminal treason as opposed to just utter incompetence. And I think it's clearly impeachable offense. For failure to protect the United States Capitol in a circumstance like this. And then I think with some of the other statutes like seditious conspiracy, I don't think it quite works either, because it suggests that the statute seems to suggest that you're the one actually doing it, as opposed to a failure to protect. I mean, you could, and one of the concerns here too is you don't want this to go too far. Then all of a sudden, any cop who does a crappy job at something is not just an incompetent cop, but potentially a criminal as well. And so there's, I think, some reason to not criminalize too much of just low-level incompetence.
Well, yeah, and there's all kinds of areas in the law where there's a very big difference between a failure to act and overt act that is part of wrongful conduct. So, I mean, that does make sense. I mean, I think you can argue, and we'll have to see what the investigation show, that if knowledge of the intent and design of all of this is important to wrongful, to being guilty of this crime, I think it's going to probably come out that Trump did know, and that he understood what was going on, and delaying the federal law enforcement going into the situation was designed to help affect something, if not actual overthrow of the government itself, certainly to affect some pretty horrible conduct. But you talked too about seditious conspiracy, and that seems to fit pretty well. And maybe treason should be reserved only for the narrowest type of conduct, but seditious conspiracy seems to fit much more completely when we look at what happened at the Capitol and those who were behind it. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, and I think if you just sort of read the seditious conspiracy statute outside of this context, and you sort of asked, a lawyer, so think of 3 or 4 examples that might fit this. I'm sure most people would come up with, a bunch of people storming the Capitol to try to prevent the laws from being executed. So yes, I do think it is a pretty good fit.
What about the members of Congress? I think this is lower down on the wrongfulness ladder, probably, but I mean, the there was a, I believe it was the Kansas City newspaper said Senator Josh Hawley has blood in his hands for, or words to that effect, because of his leadership of the opposition to the certification process, the electoral count process. You had 140 members of the House who you could argue, violated their oath as members of Congress. Several senators, although fewer than we expected, once the votes came out after this insurrection at the Capitol. How do you weigh their conduct? And I ask this because we've seen so much that's just become normalized, I think, in the last 4 or 5 years. Things that we're outraged about, we're deeply offended by, and then we say, well, yeah, that's Trump, or that's just the way things are. That's the way some people are on the far ends of the political spectrum these days. But there has to be both language and law and consequences. I mean, we are, many fine words in speeches last night about restoring the rule of law and, the shining city on the hill. Everybody wants to talk about the shining city on the hill. I don't think it's so shiny right now. It seems pretty, pretty tarnished right now because people are not respecting the rule of law. And so I'm struggling to find the right and accurate words, what is the rule of law that applies here. I think some of what those members of Congress have done by enabling and by helping to stoke the fires of disinformation about election fraud, I mean, they're responsible too. And then you get to what happened yesterday with counting the votes. I know you're not going to come at this from political perspective, but as a scholar of this body of law, where do you see that conduct fitting in, if at all?
Well, I mean, the conduct is absolutely reprehensible. And the idea that you would reject, a state's electoral votes based on completely frivolous arguments have been rejected by every court that's looked at them. And it's just, I think you're right. This is sort of utterly antithetical to their oath of office. And if you look at what Hawley was arguing, I mean, his argument about Pennsylvania was just completely inane. Right? I mean, the argument was that the Pennsylvania legislature violated its own state constitution.
Which is false.
Right. Which, first of all, is false. But even if it was true, the argument made in the other states is that, the courts had improperly messed with what the legislature had done. And the argument in those other cases is that the legislature is free to do what it wants in this area, that it's empowered by Article 2 of the Constitution to do this, even if the state constitution says otherwise. So here he comes in with an argument that's based entirely on Pennsylvania state law that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has rejected, and to say that the Congress of the United States ought to step in and fix that entirely as a matter of state law. And then, to make it even worse, even if you were right, it wouldn't affect enough ballots to make any difference.
And it was a Republican legislature.
Yes, the Republican legislature did this. And this is meant to be a serious argument. And so, I mean, Hawley, I think, should never be taken seriously by anyone ever again. But that's not the same thing, of course, as saying he actually committed a crime. I mean, I don't think any of the treason or sedition or insurrection statutes describe an extremely bad faith objection to a state's electoral vote. And at the end of the day, I'm not necessarily we even want to make that a crime, because I don't know that that's really something that ought to be judged and enforced through the criminal law rather than through the political system. And the other problem is when you get into just really bad faith behavior, like we see with people like Hawley or with Trump, you always think afterwards, well, God, that should be a crime. Really, they have to go to jail for that. And then you look at the statute books, you can't find something that quite fits because nobody ever imagined this particular horrible type of misbehavior. And so then you try to think, well, I want to prevent bad behavior going forward. So you try to write some new laws. Well, you're never going to catch every example of bad faith misuse of the system because you just can't write a criminal code that looks like that. And we just depend on people acting for the most part in good faith, even if we disagree with them. They have different political principles, fine, but we expect that they will play by the basic rules. And so when people stop doing that, then it becomes very hard for the system to work.
All right, let's summarize then. So the throngs that stormed the Capitol, there's a whole variety of federal law, because this happened in the federal district, that they could be prosecuted for. Whether they will be prosecuted, we'll see. But everything from destruction of property on up to possibly treason, depending on what their intent was. Someone who says, I'm coming to overthrow the government, or this is revolution, that could theoretically anyway support a treason charge. Seditious conspiracy, you've argued, fits because it's a bit broader in its scope than treason, appropriately narrow in its scope. And as for President Trump, impeach, yes. 25th Amendment, removal from office, we'll see. I think that I believe there's a good case for it. It seems like there's a growing chorus for that. Incitement to riot, arguably, I would say probably. If you look at what happened on Wednesday. Treason, harder to say as to Trump. Seditious conspiracy, depending on what his knowledge, involvement, actions are seen to have actually been, possibly. Does that seem like a fair summary?
That's a fair paraphrase. Yes, absolutely.
What do you think's actually going to happen?
Well, one of my worries is that Trump will just try to issue some type of blanket pardon for everybody involved.
Yeah.
In the Capitol incident before he goes out, and that would really be unfortunate. And I think that's one of the concerns for the people who want to do the 25th Amendment is you could do that could trigger immediately, and you could prevent him from doing that. And if that happens, then most of these legal issues would go away. My hope is that the next 2 weeks will go fairly quietly, and Trump will shuffle off to the ignominy that will be the rest of his life, and we can take a hard look at what happened. Prosecute the relevant people, beef up Capitol security, and make sure that something like this never happens again.
Is there? I've explored this concept, and I'll so appreciate your time, also. I'll wrap up with this. I've explored this idea in other contexts that there's value in prosecution, even trial, of certain crimes, certain very serious crimes, because of the extent of disinformation. I'm thinking of Nuremberg as probably the leading example. There was no prosecution that was going to bring back the millions of people who were killed. No compensation even imaginable for the horrors of what happened in Nazi Germany, but an important historical purpose in the trials of not only the major Nazi figures, but on down the line. And the trials of Nazis went on for years and years in Germany against tremendous opposition among the German people. This is no laughing matter. I mean, these are the most serious crimes you can think of in some way. And what happened, that we're able to talk about what has happened on Wednesday, what's been happening for weeks since the November election in these terms: treason, sedition, incitement to riot. I get, Trump just, slinking off into whatever his own future is in shame and ignominy. But is there some argument for accountability and prosecution? Because we're looking at tens of millions of people, not just a few thousand, who have been fed a diet of this for weeks and months and maybe years.
Well, I think, this is going to be a big problem for the Biden Justice Department. We off the top of our head, we know crimes going back to those in the Mueller report. There's at least a serious argument there for obstruction of justice. Maybe statute of limitations is run on that. I'm not sure. But even just things like the phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State, which may well violate federal laws and possibly state law as well. There'll be numerous state courts that'll be doing criminal proceedings against Trump based on things he did prior to his presidency. There'll be civil suits that have been stalled that will be back running. And I assume there's a whole lot more that we don't know. We only know about this Georgia call because the Georgia Secretary of State happened to release it because Trump then later seemed to have lied about it. And once Biden people really get into the administration, things are going to come out, and with some of the rats jumping off the ship, they'll start telling stories about Trump, and so we'll learn all kinds of things, and there'll be very difficult decisions about whether or not he should be charged. And I think the basic tenet of the rule of law is you don't get to commit crimes and get away with it. And the presidency is not a license to commit a crime. At the same time, I think we also just have to recognize the reality that a huge chunk of the country will view all those prosecutions as politically motivated, and that will arguably, they'll view Trump as a martyr. And it's not clear that as satisfying as Trump in prison would be to many Democrats, that would ultimately help the country get through this. And so I think it's a very difficult question. And I really do not envy Merrick Garland coming in to do this job, because if I were asked to do it, I would find this exceptionally challenging. I do think if I were presented with, here's a list of 15 Trump crimes, I might skip the bottom 14 or 15, right? Yeah. You might just want to really focus on the ones that are absolutely the most serious, the ones where you're most likely to get a conviction.
I'm not laughing like this is haha funny. I'm just, it is just amazing that this is where we are. But I think you're right. I think you're right. These are going to be some really, really tough decisions. I understand Biden doesn't want his entire presidency to be dominated by Donald Trump. He's got other things he wants to try to get done, including, I think, genuinely figuring out how to heal the divisions in the country. And that's not going to happen as easily if Donald Trump stays on the front, on the front pages.
Right. Donald, he loves being the center of attention. He loves being the center of a circus, and it's hard to imagine more of a circus than a criminal trial of Donald Trump.
Well, we'll end it there. I'm so disturbed, but I can't thank you enough, Carlton Larson. If your students listen, they might get some insights into those exam questions that are coming. So you may not want to do that. But I certainly appreciate it. I know our listeners appreciate your time. We'll put a link to your Washington Post piece. It's a great, concise summary of a lot of what we've been talking about today. We'll put a link to that in the description so people can get it. Carlton Larson from the UC Davis, University of California, Davis School of Law, and author of the book On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to Law. We'll also put links to the books in the description if people want to get a copy of either of your books. We'll make it easy for them to do that. So thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
Oh, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.